Today we're going to be doing hair. So just the direction that it grows, the kind of hair that you're doing, highlights and lowlights, obviously, what brushes to use and what colours. Again, it's just me giving you tips and tricks of being a portrait artist and a fashion illustrator for over 20 years, and I hope it helps. By the way, I have resolved now the problem with no one being able to leave any comments. Turns out that I had made my videos kid friendly, and that for some reason makes you unable to leave comments, but you can leave comments or obviously questions on all of my previous videos as of now. Technical genius. Okay, have a lovely week, and I hope you enjoyed today's little tips. So I usually start by using the dagger, or the striper brush as it's sometimes called. It's good because you can use it in different ways, holding it in different directions, using the flat side, or also using the fine side, almost like a point, like here you can get really fine lines, which is great, and then quickly change it and put it on an edge. I find that starting off with a darker colour, so here I'm just using a dark brown or a Van Dyke brown, that gives me a good base. So I'm leaving gaps, I'm leaving space between the marks that I'm making. I'll darken areas to begin with, namely the top of the head and around the curve. If you think back to when we did the clock, it's at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. That's where the highlights usually sit. So every time you have a curve, you can imagine there's a little clock in that curve, like here, and you can imagine 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. So continuing, it's really about a lot of repetition and also staying loose. You want to be able to do long strokes that are free, but you also, at times, you can just use a rigger brush like the one I've got here, and that gives you really long, thin lines. And I know it sounds tedious, but to get a really realistic look with hair, you do have to pay attention and go into the detail, unless you're doing something more stylized, which I'll show you a little bit later on. But yeah, rigger brush is really good. They're the ones that typically with really, long bristles. So even here, if I had curly hair, I would start off by using a rigger brush and just repeatedly make a similar movement. Go into your darks whenever you want to with curly hair, because there's so much chaos in curls. If you can start picking out areas that you've already put down and then start putting a little bit of dark into some areas that will work as a curl, it's best to start with a medium or a lighter tone of the colour that your hair is and go from there. When I'm holding my brush, I'm holding it very vertically, and I'm using my little finger to actually slide against the page. When you start doing hair, just as you touch the brush to the page, you don't want it to be a heavy blob. So dragging your little finger or something along the page will give you that little bit of leverage to touch the page softly and not start with a heavy line. And also, as you can see here, I'm doing repetitive colour now, starting to add in a little bit of blue and a little bit of purple, because it's in the shady areas. I don't want to go just brown, dark brown, light brown, black. That helps give you a little bit of variety in the hair as well. I'll talk about colours at the end, put the colours up actually. So same here, now I'm doing with the curls. You can see I'm just adding to the detail. Repetition again, over and over and over. So the more that you can practice the weight of the brush touching the page, the more control you'll end up with eventually. And it might be awkward for you to put your little finger down and glide it along the page. So think about something else. You might use just the base of your hand, or you might just hover your hand over the page. It's up to you. And it's free. Now I'll show you a quick little just shiny black hair demo. And with this, it's far less detail than you can see that I've already done. So this is more like if you had a smaller figure in a painting or you were stylizing it. You didn't need to go to too much detail, but you wanted to specifically show the hairdo and the style. With this again, I'm repeating marks over and over and over again. So the more that you can practice those specific little strokes, obviously here this is shorter hair, it's a bob, so there's a shorter stroke happening. I'm using just the round brush because I don't need to get those really, really fine lines that I did when I was painting the longer hair. And this is where you have just more of a filled in area of colour to show the hair. You may not have a lot of sunlight, so you won't have huge amounts of highlights and lowlights, and it won't be a huge contrast. In this case, I start with just this base as I've put down, which is more of a, I guess, semi-transparent base, and I just put the line work as a layer over the base. Here again, I'm just using the round brush. I don't need to get individual hairs like too specifically shown, so I can kind of block all my strokes together by repeating that same swoosh forward and backward stroke. I'm actually giving the hair volume. It's sometimes good to use a little piece of card like this and brush from the card onto the hair if you want to get a really sharp edge for the hairline. I use it specifically when I'm doing fashion illustration, if I've done a lot of work on an outfit and I want the hair to end in a straight line. Now I'm just adding some darkness here. The rule is with hair, the stronger the contrast or the higher the contrast, that means the darker the darks and the lighter the lights, the shinier and healthier the hair will look. So whether you start with, like this one, I did a medium base to start painting over, but you notice I did leave the paper raw and open on those highlight areas. There's no paint there at all. But now I'm actually going back in and adding the darkness. And you can see as I do it, I'll go down to a smaller brush, the dark actually makes the highlights pop, and suddenly the hair looks much more shiny than it did before. Now I'll using this lighter. I'm using the smaller brush to actually add those free-flowing, wild little loose individual hairs. I could use a small rigger brush here as well, but just time and experience has given me the ability to use just a round brush and keep those lines really small. The one difference between, people say, oh, why do you need to use a rigger brush? Look, you don't really, but in the beginning, and by beginning I mean the first year or two, it does make it easier to use a rigger brush just because the bristles are so long, they hold a lot of moisture. They also make your marks more forgiving, that long bristle. So if you see here, if I'm making a jittery line, it's not very forgiving with those short bristles, but if I had really long bristles, then they take up some of the unevenness. I'm adding some darkness now, low lights, to this first original hair, just purely to show you that point of the stronger contrast gives you the stronger effect. Now, problems you may come up against when you start to do hair. The number one problem that my students always used to talk about was getting the shine, getting the life and the highlights and not making it look muddy. This will happen if you start your base colouring or hair strokes too dark. Then you have to use white added in to get your highlights, and if you're not colour mixing correctly, you will start to get muddy highlights. It's best if you're using watercolour just to leave the paper as your highlight, and that means starting off with lots of strokes rather than the technique I did on the bottom left here. So even with the black hair, you can see I left a lot of highlights and just did minimal hair. Once it's dry, you can go back over it and you can add in colour, you can add in pencils over the top, So for instance, if I want a bluish highlight, I can just add this in with a bit of watercolor pencil or even normal colored pencil. So don't fear starting with a lot of white paper there and building the hair up. You do actually have to have patience to do hair well, because it is a real process. It's bit by bit by bit building up. I've just used some watercolor pencil here, so I'm just going to wet that and bleed that into the edges of my highlights to give it a little bit of a, you know that people have that lovely really black hair and it's got bluish shine on it. Yeah. So that's another thing. You can tint the color of the hair by doing a final wash. I could get a really strong color and of say reddish auburn red and wash it over the highlights and everything, just so it's transparent, but it's got the strength of color in it. Another problem that people have is that they can't get the lines fine enough. You can use watercolor pencils or just coloring pencils. They equate to like the same as a small round brush. If you have a jittery hand, that makes it a bit easier as well to hold a pencil very vertically still, just as you would a brush. And try to even flow your hand by not even touching the page and just running it over top of the paint. Gives it a good effect, nice and free. The main thing is, because you're using a pencil, you don't want to be caught on tightening up. Here I'm just going to use a little bit of pencil over the top of the black hair, and I'm adding a little bit of colour because black usually throws blue in the highlights, really, really black hair. It's also fun to try adding in a few different colours. Don't just go for browns or gold. You know, throw in some bluish tones, some reddish auburn tones, even purples. It looks really exciting, and you start to experiment and you get more enthusiasm about what you're doing. Because remember, at the end of the day, you doing your art, it should be bringing you joy, it should be bringing you that peace, or I don't know, joy, energy, whatever it is that you're looking for with your art. You shouldn't be following all the rules. So here I'm darkening the bottom, just working up from the bottom because I want this to be a straight edged hair. And by darkening the edges, you can see it kind of gives you the feeling of that hair going backwards or curling under. So I remember before I used the piece of card to, you know, line up the bottom of the hair. Obviously that's a good thing to do if you want it to be extremely neat, but you don't have to. But yeah, here I'm increasing the shine immediately because I'm darkening the darks. So look at how that pops out, but see where I'm putting it? It actually is like the area of the head where it starts to curve in, your skull starts to curve in. So that's facing down away from the light. So that's it for this week, and just remember that you actually can leave a comment or a question. Have a great week, and let's be creative.